Hi everybody, thanks for coming back and listening to us again. I had a trip to Kent last week, down Canterbury way, and while I was there I did a bit of driving around looking at different places and went to Ramsgate. Drove by Ramsgate Harbour, and it made me think about a very old friend of mine, William Walker, who flew Spitfires with 616 Squadron in the Battle of Britain from Kenley, and was shot down on the 26th of August 1940 and was brought ashore at Ramsgate. So for sure I was thinking of William. He was an absolutely wonderful man, softly spoken, a gentleman. You couldn't imagine anybody less like an august fighter pilot, an absolute gent. And we corresponded for years. And he shared his memories with me, and this started 40 years ago, and absolutely wonderful man. So using his own words, I was able to tell the story in Letters from the Few, along with other friends, which is all arisen from our correspondence. So the correspondence is an important primary source. It's a record in their own words of their experiences. So with that in mind, I thought, well, I went down to the National Battle of Britain Memorial at Capel-le-Fern to see my friend Jules Gomez, the site manager, and catch up with him while I was down in Kent. And again, William's presence was there because his ashes are buried there, and there's a memorial tablet to him. And he was a poet. He was very keen on his poetry and used to write poems about his experiences, as in fact also did Wing Commander Christopher Bunny Current, who saw poetry as a means of expunging his survivor guilt and PTSD, which we often talked about. But William, his poem is there. It's part of the Christopher Foxley Norris Memorial Wall that records the names of all of the few. So, you know, it was quite special to me that I should think of William when I was at Ramsgate, a few miles away, and then I get down to Capel, that wonderful site that it is, and there's William's ashes and his poem. So with all of that in mind, I thought that I'd try and share William's story with you through this brilliant medium of video and YouTube. And unusually, what I decided to do, I'm going to read some of his experiences. So this is actually in his own words. So first of all, he joined the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve at Kidlington, Oxfordshire, on the 2nd of September 1938. So the Volunteer Reserve, these people are, it's based on the citizen volunteer principle, so that people are in their civilian jobs, studying at night school in the evening and learning to fly at the weekends. So they're still embedded in civilian life, but in the event of an emergency, they form an important reserve and can be called up. And of course, that's exactly what happened in August and September 1939. So William is mobilised with the rest of the country and goes to initial training wing at Cambridge University, where they did their square bashing and basic military training before going off to flying training, service flying training. So a lot of the training prior to that, while they're still civilians, is at civilian flying school. So now they're in the Royal Air Force and off we go. So William ends up on course 45 at Brize Norton, also in Oxfordshire, where he flies the Harvard, the two-seater single-engine trainer, which he's delighted about because those who go on to Harvard and not twin-engined aircraft are really destined to be single-engine fighter pilots, and that is what he wants to be. So I just want to talk about his first night flight because it is quite an amusing story, although it could well have ended up in tragedy. And he says, I had my first ever night flight of 45 minutes on 30th of March 1940 with Flight Sergeant Holman as instructor. And after a further 45-minute flight with Flight Lieutenant Sykes on 1st of April, I was dispatched on my first solo night flight. I took off into complete darkness after leaving the flare path. There were no ground lights due to the wartime blackout, and there was no moon. I must have become completely disorientated, and in a matter of minutes, I crashed into a field. The plane was utterly smashed, but by some miracle of fate, my starboard wing had hit the ground with such force, around 200 miles an hour, that the entire engine had broken away from its mounting and had spun off to finish some distance away. This had not only saved my life, but had prevented the aircraft from catching fire. I climbed out of what remained of the cockpit and walked with my parachute across several fields back to the aerodrome and into the locker room where several pilots were hanging about as all night flying had been abandoned. They were completely surprised when I walked in, as they were certain that I had bought it. As several ambulances and vehicles had been dispatched to find the wreckage and bring back my remains, if any. Somebody produced a flask of whiskey and suggested that I must need it, but I said better not, in case somebody smells my breath. I scarcely had a scratch and no bones were broken. I then returned to the mess and went to bed. And for thereafter, on course 45, little wonder that William was known as Lucky Bugger Walker, because for sure he was. When course 45 finished, and William was reflecting on this many years later in our correspondence, he had this to say. He said, looking back to the time when so many of us on course number 45 had such high hopes and felt invulnerable, it is terribly sad that some would not survive a year, would never see the enemy, and all their hard work and training should prove fruitless. Whilst they were just casualties of war in the records, they are a reminder to me of many happy days of friendship that are well worth recalling and should be remembered. And I think that's a fantastic sentiment. So after Bryce Norton, Pilot Officer William Walker is posted to 616 Squadron at Leconfield. Now 616 is an auxiliary Air Force squadron, but now the identity of these squadrons is already starting to slightly change. The auxiliary Air Force is raised on the territorial principle, similar to the Territorial Army. So the personnel are all drawn locally, and that's why you could have family members serving in the same squadron, which was all very well, but when the shooting started and casualties started racking up, the morale of some of these squadrons did suffer quite badly because of that, understandably. But William is one of the first volunteer reserve pilots posted in to swell the ranks of 616 Squadron. And that was on the 22nd of June 1940. So this is just after Dunkirk and in the lull before the Battle of Britain. And he says, the following day, 23rd of June 1940, I flew a Spitfire Mark I on my first solo. During the following week, I flew a total of 18 hours on Spitfires, doing various exercises such as cloud flying, camera gun practice, formation flying, sector reconnaissance, etc. On 1st of July, I was detailed to do a practice battle climb with an operational pilot and another pilot also under training. It was a glorious summer's day with splendid visibility, and we climbed to 20,000 feet. It was sheer joy to be flying such a lovely aircraft in such beautiful conditions with the English landscape spread out below. So, with just 19 hours flying time on Spitfires, William himself is made operational. Then on the 19th of August 1940, so this is the day after Kenley in Surrey has been absolutely battered on what Alfred Price called the hardest day, 18th of August 1940. 616 Squadron fly south to Kenley, where they relieve 64 Squadron. So when they get down there, they find a very different scenario to Leconfield. Kenley is under attack. It's an operational sector station right in the thick of the fighting, one of the sector stations in the Ring of Steel around London. And what William says about that time, and 616's experience up to that point largely consisted of chasing lone reconnaissance bombers around the north of England, and then the Junkers Party of 15th of August 1940, when Luftwaffe 5, based in Norway, attacked northeast England and was basically defeated in a single day. But all of that was very different because those raids are unescorted by ME-109s, and the presence of ME-109s changes absolutely everything. As Battle of Britain Spitfire pilot Peter Brown once said to me, the change in the tempo of operations and the tempo of combat because of the ME-109 was traumatic. I think that's a great word to describe this. And William says the early days of war were interesting insofar as we were so unprepared for what was to come. It is my lasting regret that I did not have more operational training. Trying to pick it up with the squadron straight from flying school was a pretty haphazard affair. The mess at Kenley was a rather sombre building and far removed from the modern, light and cheerful mess at Leconfield. Kenley bore so many scars as witness to damage and loss of life caused by enemy action. An atmosphere of purpose prevailed, and we found ourselves having to respond to a life of far greater activity than at Leconfield, where only a few minor raids had disrupted our existence. 3 days later, the squadron experienced its first clash with the enemy. Flying out of Kenley, and in short order, the Spitfires are bounced by Jagdgeschwader 51, and Pilot Officer Hugh Cocky Dundas is shot down by Werner Molders, the father of modern air fighting. So Cocky Dundas ends up bailing out with a broken shoulder and is wounded, and it's not really a great start. Let's put it that way. 25th of August, the squadron is vectored to intercept 20 Dornier 17s escorted by 109s, and the Spitfires are again bounced and broken up, and Sergeant Westmoreland is killed and Sergeant Waring reported missing. So this is absolutely classic about the tempo of combat and how those 109s changed everything. And William wrote to me and he said, "We were very unsure of ourselves at this time. Everything happened so quick. And of course, our formations of Vicks and lines astern were all wrong. There was so little information available to us. Very little was passed on by those squadrons that were relieved, as they just couldn't wait to get the hell out of the place. Fighting in the south, where the 109s always seemed to have the advantage of heightened sun, was very different indeed to chasing after unescorted bombers up north." So that really bears out what we've been talking about. But then we come to William's great adventure on the 26th of August 1940. And again, this is in his own words. "It was still dark when the orderly awoke me with a cup of tea at 0330 hours that morning, just 2 days after my 27th birthday, which had passed unnoticed amid the current level of activity and excitement. I drank my tea slowly and gradually awakened to another day. It seemed such a short while since we had been stood down the previous evening at about 2100 hours, and after which a few beers refreshed our spirits before bed. However, I dressed and went down to breakfast, always a quiescent occasion at the unearthly hour of 0400. The sound of aero engines could be heard in the distance, indicating that the ground crews were already busy. One was so accustomed to the drone of engines that it passed almost unnoticed amid the clatter of cups and plates. Following breakfast, I joined the other pilots outside the mess. We all climbed aboard a lorry and were driven to dispersal to remain at Readiness, where a hut and a few tents constituted the squadron's base. A few days earlier, the Duke of Kent had actually paid us a visit at our modest location to wish us well. That day, I was allocated Spitfire R6633 and was to fly in Yellow Section, led by Flying Officer Teddy St. Aubin, a former Guards officer. The plane stood within 50 yards of our hut, and so I walked over and placed my parachute in the cockpit with the straps spread apart and ready for wearing immediately I jumped in. 2 of the ground crew stood by the plane with the starter battery plugged in. I walked back to the hut as the sun rose and added a little warmth to the chilly start. Pilots sat about either reading or exchanging the usual banter that had become routine. We had spent many months in this way, which was now a way of life. At 8 a.m, our second breakfast arrived at dispersal and was just as fulfilling as our breakfast of 4 hours earlier. Coffee, eggs, bacon, sausages and toast to replenish our undiminished appetites. The telephone suddenly rang in the dispersal hut and a shout went up, "Yellow section, scramble! Patrol Dungeness, Dover, Angels 20. This sent me running for my Spitfire. I leapt onto the wing and it was in the cockpit, parachute strapped on within seconds. I pressed the starter and the engine fired immediately. The ground crew removed the plug from the cowling and pulled the remote starter battery clear. I waved the chocks away and taxied the aircraft, following my section leader and Sergeant Ridley to the end of the runway for takeoff. Within minutes, Yellow Section was airborne. We headed east, climbing quickly and passing through cloud, reached our patrol course in some 15 to 20 minutes. We flew in a wide formation that day, in fact, and had been airborne for about an hour without sighting an enemy aircraft when suddenly several Me-109s appeared. So high above Yellow Section was the entirety of JG-51. So you're looking at about 100 Me-109. And they're led in person again by the Commodore, Major Werner Molders himself. And they're on a Fry Hunter, which is basically a free-ranging fighter sweep, looking for trouble. So the 109s drop behind and below the Spitfires, and Molders himself selects William Walker's aircraft and he attacks it from the blind spot below and behind. So William continues. When the 109s hit us, I banked sharply to port towards the 109, but suddenly my machine was raked with bullets. The one that attacked me did so from below and behind. I never even saw it. The flying control ceased to respond and a sudden pain in my leg indicated that I had been hit. Bailing out seemed to be a very sensible option. My 2 comrades, St. Aubin and Sergeant Ridley, had both vanished. I pulled back the hood and tried to stand up, but realised I had not disconnected the radio lead, which was still plugged in, and had to remove my helmet before I was free to jump. The aircraft was still banking to port, so jumping out was easy. I was still at 20,000 feet and pulled the ripcord immediately. A sudden jerk indicated all was well, and I was on my way down. I looked around, but could see not a single aircraft. Below, there was 10/10 cloud. I had no idea where I was. It seemed to take ages to reach the clouds, and passing through, I realised I was still over the channel. Thinking that I would soon land in the sea, prompted the thought that I'd better remove my heavy flying boots. I did this and let them fall. I watched them spiral down for what seemed like ages, and then realised that I was much higher than I thought. I inflated my Mae West and eventually landed in the sea. I easily discarded my parachute and could see the wreck of a ship sticking out of the water a few hundred yards away and swam to it. I reached it and climbed on, sitting there for about half an hour until a fishing boat came alongside and I clambered aboard. I was now extremely cold from my immersion and wet clothes. The fishermen gave me a cup of tea, well laced with whiskey, as we headed for land. When about 2 miles offshore, an RAF launch came alongside and I was transferred to it. By this time, the tea concoction had worked quite disastrously on my cold stomach. Fortunately, there was a loo aboard, to which I retired with some relief. I was still enthroned when we reached Ramsgate Harbour. An aircraftman kept knocking on the door and inquiring whether I was all right. It was some time before I was able to emerge. As I carried up the steps to a waiting ambulance, by which time quite a crowd had gathered, and gave me a cheer as I was put in it, a kind old lady handed me a packet of cigarettes, so I decided that being shot down was perhaps not such a bad thing after all. But Yellow Section's Marmaduke Ridley had not been so lucky. He'd been shot down by Hutman Yoshko Fuzzo, Staffel Captain of 4 JG-51, and killed. And Flying Officer St. Aubin had been shot down by Oberleutnant Pips Priller, Stabelkapitän of 6 JG51. His Spitfire caught fire, but he managed to crash land at Eastchurch Airfield. 616 Squadron suffered other losses too, including Pilot Officer George Mobley and another pilot wounded. So on 26th of August 1940, 616 had lost 7 Spitfires in one day. So that was 7 of the 12 that they lost in total on operations flying from Kenley. So 2 pilots were dead, 4 were wounded. So William was one of the lucky ones. The squadron's orderly clerk must have been a true master of the understatement, because in the squadron's operations record book, which is its diary, he's recorded it as a very unfortunate engagement. Well, I should say it was. So, cutting a very long story short, which William has recounted with his usual good humour and skilled writing, William was first at Ramsgate Hospital, then he was transferred to RAF Halton Hospital, where a 7.92mm bullet was extracting from his ankle, and that bullet he carried with him as a talisman and kept it all his life. Now, he was lucky, because on the 3rd of September 1940, 616 Squadron had only 8 of its original members left, who'd arrived at Kenley on the 19th of August, and they were relieved by 64 Squadron, and off they went. They'd lost 11 Spitfires, destroyed, and 3 damaged. So William's passing comment about that day and about that time at Kenley, he said, "It's sad that the best pilots seem to get killed whilst the hams like myself survived. They were exhilarating days, but one lost so many good friends who were all so young." And William went back to operational flying very briefly with Douglas Bader's Tangmere wing, but he didn't like Bader and Bader didn't like him, William said. So William was shunted off to training command to be an instructor and other non-operational flying. But he was quite old to be a fighter pilot, because by then, 1941, he was 28. So, you know, an old man by fighter pilot standards. After the war, he worked in the brewery industry in a very senior executive capacity, retired, and sadly left us on the 21st of October 2012, aged 99. And I lost a good friend that day. He really was an absolute gentleman. He attended, I think, every single book launch, every single exhibition I ever put on. He was absolutely brilliant. And just to conclude, I'll read you the poem that is inscribed on the memorial wall down at the National Memorial that William wrote, and I'm sure it'll resonate with you as much as it did with me. Here inscribed the names of friends we knew, young men with whom we often flew, scrambled to many angels high. They knew that they or their friends may die. Many were very scarcely trained, and many badly burned or maimed. Behind each name a story lies of bravery in summer skies, though many brave unwritten tales were simply told in vapour trails. Outnumbered every day they flew, remembered here as just the few. And isn't that brilliant? So I suppose what William's talking about as well, about recording stories, is very much what I'm about and was always about, and hence the, you know, all of this correspondence, and these are stories that wouldn't otherwise have been told. When I started it, I was probably only in my early 20s, or actually a lot younger in respect to one or two things. So, you know, I'm quite proud of the fact that we've recorded these stories and published them so that they can be shared. because people like William Walker and many of the others, the majority of pilots, the majority of servicemen, in fact, they are anonymous. And unlike the famous pilots like the Barders, the Johnsons, the Tucks, and so on, who either have books written about them or write books themselves, they've got no platform to share those stories. And that is what I was about. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that those stories were not lost. And I hope that we've done that. Certainly have, actually. So thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed William's story. It's much more detailed in the book, obviously, in Letters from the Few. And if you've enjoyed the videos, we've got lots more videos coming about Battle of Britain pilots, about the battle itself, some startling discoveries I've made during this marathon 1 million word project for the Battle of Britain Memorial Trust, this 8-volume official history of the Battle of Britain that's published by Pen and Sword. So all kinds of things. And if you enjoy listening, watching, you enjoy what we do, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and help us grow the community. So thanks for listening, and that's William Walker's story.